he came back with coconut bras and grass skirts, and he had us put on all this paraphernalia in the living room of the house. He was staying with us because he was still in his early 20s. And we all dressed up in coconut bras and grass skirts. He had been in New Caledonia in the South Pacific. And he came back with a Martin ukulele that he claimed he had won in a poker game in Honolulu. And he sang all these songs. That was my first memory. He sang all these songs. Among them were like, I want to go back to my little grass shack in Kealakaku, Hawaii, you know, and 5'2", Eyes of Blue, Ain't She Sweet. And the tune that fascinated me the most was this wonderful tune called Bye Bye Blackbird. The melody is really, it's beautiful. Bye bye Blackbird. A friend of mine whose father was a war hero in World War II told me that he heard from his dad that that's a song that they sang in the pubs in England before flying over to the continent during World War II. The U.S. forces brought that song back to America, and the Blackbird was the original toucan on the Guinness Stout cans. That was the Bye Bye Blackbird, and maybe they adopted the songs, but all these RAF and U.S. pilots, you know, I mean, unfortunately, we were at war, but all that folklore that I've started to hear about kind of sparked my interest. And but from the ukulele, I started messing around, and over the next few years, I learned from my Uncle Jimmy. I mean, I didn't play ukulele at 4 years old, but I did dance the hula in a grass skirt. And you know, let's see, when I was about 11 or 12, I still had the ukulele going, and I started writing my own songs. The first song I ever wrote was called Blueberry Blues, about eating too much blueberry pie at my grandfather's house. Blueberry blues, blueberry blues, someday you're gonna have them too. They're a special kind of blues, made only for a fool, you know. It was kind of a swing tune, you know, because that's what I was learning. But Elvis Presley had, I was 12 at that point, and Elvis, I think this was probably just before, or just at the beginning of the rock and roll thing. I was a square dancer. I was going to square dances every Friday night, dancing to the banjos and fiddles, and finally I could see what the instruments were. And then in my hometown, they had a thing called the Strawberry Festival every spring. And a bunch of, there was a square dance caller named Dick Best, and he lived in New Hampshire, and he knew all the dances and stuff, so we learned all the steps, you know, Alaman left, do-si-dos, and all this great stuff. And around that time is when I was 9 when I first saw my first instruments. I'm kind of going in circles here because the earliest, there was a very important thing that happened to me. My parents, when I was 5 years old, went down to Cape Cod and took a cottage, and I think they wanted some intimate time, and I was the kid, you know, and so they let me out, you know, off the leash on the beach, and the beach was on a sand spit near a place we called the Inlet after we got to know the area, and it was a wild bird sanctuary, and so they let me get out there, and there were horseshoe crabs in the waters in those days. It was very pre the effects of industrialized climate effect, and there, you know, there's all kinds of wildlife. And I walked out, and on the porch of the house next door were 2 guys in flannel shirts playing guitar. So this would have been, when I was 5 years old, this would have been 1947. And that's the first music I ever, well, aside from Uncle Jimmy, yeah. So then there was these guitar players. Now, at the time, Harvard University was beginning to birth the folk movement. And the folk movement had a lot to do with the arts and crafts movement. So you had people collecting shawls and blankets and homemade things, and Appalachian crafts was starting to show up. I learned this, I saw them later, but so this is some of the students at Harvard were learning to play, but at that time, Eric von Schmidt told me his dad was Eric von Schmidt Sr. heard Leadbelly, Huddy Ledbetter, who I guess everybody knows pretty much. Anybody not know who Huddy Leadbelly was? Anyway, he came up from Louisiana with the Alan Lomax, the two Lomaxes. It was Alan and his son John, or John and his son Alan. They came up to New York City. Now, the milieu of that time, I was always a little bit, 5 years younger than what was going on, so I caught it on the 5 years later. But what was going on at that time was this folk music thing, the rediscovery of American roots music. And the Lomaxes had been down in Texas and all over the South recording, just anything you can find that was recorded by them. They used to be out on a World Heritage label, different labels. I don't know where their recordings are now. But this sense of universality of music was part of the theme. Alan, at one point, ended his life in New York creating the Universal Jukebox with recordings from all over the world, so you could go from Appalachia to Ethiopia with just pushing a button. And that was his, alchemical musical dream. But so at that time, the time of square dancing, and I must say the beginning of the communist McCarthy hearings were just on the horizon, because all the people in folk music, and now we're talking about, I'll say some names, but I mean, back to Leadbelly. Leadbelly came up with the Lomaxes, and Eric von Schmidt recounted to me that when he heard Leadbelly on the radio, he immediately went out and they had a record that they were releasing. It was kind of his tour, folk music legend. And the Lomaxes were famously annoyed with Leadbelly because, they said, well, after the show, he'd go out with his people and we wouldn't see him for a couple of days, and he was a black man, been in prison, and the Lomaxes gotten him out somehow. And the thing about Leadbelly was they presented him in denim overalls and a bandana, and he was like, no. As soon as he made some money, he went out and he got tailored suits in New York City, because he was, he was riding high. But he was a tremendously warm person, and some of the songs of Leadbelly are, Good Night Irene, Good Night, that's Leadbelly. And he was a repository of the roots of southern Louisiana and East Texas. And when Eric heard that music, for example, of how this folk music hit people, he went into the basement of his dad's house and lived down there for 2 weeks, refusing to come out until he had learned every song on that Leadbelly record. And Eric von Schmidt then came up to Harvard Square and started to influence people like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. In fact, the song Baby Let Me Follow You Down, Bob learned from Eric. Now, Jim Rooney last night, who was presenting with me, for me, thank you, Jim, he was a few years older than myself, and he had been to Greece in studying the classics, Homer and stuff like this. So there was all these elements. You get the radical work songs. You got Woody Guthrie, and you got Jim coming back from Europe with he'd been studying the works of Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, with under the tradition of Milman Paris Parry at Harvard. And the theme was that they had rediscovered a bunch of singers in in Albania or something, they had found singers that could sing the epic of the fall of Constantinople, which was 1,000 years before, and they knew all the verses. And if it took a half a day to sing, they were fine. And we found out that, and Jim found out that the whole thing is based on themes, the sunrise over the water, the rosy-fingered dawn, all these sort of cliches, but they're not. They're coded. They're coded language, and in that language is all the hints of like maybe every word is a verse that follows. So, you sing the coded introduction to that verse, and then you know that the first thing you're going to sing about is the color of the waves, and then the ship's on the waves of Ulysses going on his journey. So these Harvard, I don't know if they were Harvard students. It could have been Woody Guthrie and Cisco Houston for all I know, but they saw me listening, and out on the beach, I was like mesmerized. They were playing two guitars. I just never forgot it. And they came over. Of course, my parents are looking for quiet, intimate time. And they're like, oh, how do you do? And then my mother was very proper Bostonian. I remember her saying to my husband, Peter, we don't know these people. And they're just like, and they're not hippies or anything like that, but they are, of a new kind of breed, a kind of like folk roots, and they had the big guitars. Now, I've never seen a guitar like that. And there's such a rich sound. They were Martin guitars, I think, in my memory. Anyway, they convinced my parents that because I liked music so much, they said, your son is listening to us out there. As a 5-year-old, you're mostly just in the way a lot, because, the younger brother is about to be conceived, and you're part of a family that's going to grow. And so I had a lot of alone time, and I loved the outdoors. In fact, I remember getting spanked because I went down past the brook out behind our house. There was a creek, out across the meadow. And of course, I'm listening to Peter and the Wolf. My mother would play that every morning. The duck in the wolf's belly, you could hear it quacking. My imagination. And the other record that I was listening to was Hopalong Cassidy and the Singing Bandit. And you had a book, and the instructions were, whenever you hear the singing bandit sing, you turn the page, right? So the song, what the singing bandit did was, it would be like, they began, I learned all the sound effects, so they'd be galloping along, yeah, I think we're on the trail, that's right. Then you'd hear, whoa, it's the singing bandit. Turn the page. It's just funny things. Well, anyway, these two, I don't know who they were, but they were definitely on the trail of this new music, which was based on guitars. And they came over and they gave us a concert. And that, I would think, was the real first. They came over and, my parents were they were formal, They said, well, we have to have something. They made little canopies or something like that. And these Harvard, I think they were Harvard students. I don't know who they were. They could have been Woody Guthrie. I just don't know. But they came over and they sang for about 40 minutes in the little living room of this cottage by the sea. And it impressed me deeply because I really got to zone in on, listen to this. I was fascinated, the tone of these instruments, the warmth that filled the room. These were wooden cottages. These were little summer cottages. And so they were acoustic, they were wood. And then my mother's brother was a entrepreneur up in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and we used to go to the family party. We'd go every Labor Day, and he had a house built